Williams, and I am from the University of Sydney. The talk I'm going to be going through today is exactly almost as the title kind of suggests. While we did get a grant from Learning Sciences, and we thank them very much for that, we did not intend to use the Learning Sciences during COVID-19 because, like everyone, we didn't intend for COVID-19. So this is very much a story of we brought it in and it happened to be really useful at the time. So as a quick start off, so in Australia, right back at the start of 2020, you might remember that, it feels like it was about 10 years ago, but Australia was literally on fire. The eastern coast, we had awful bushfires, and we were just coming out the back of that. At which point, what I'm referring to as the world's angriest tennis ball, COVID-19 came along and threw everything off. So obviously it was a huge global pandemic, and it completely changed the way we have been teaching and are currently teaching. With regards to lectures, we all know we either went online, we recorded in some way, or we did live through Zoom. Tutorials, I bought the school, or I literally went to all of our tech stores nearby, bought all the iPads I could access, and we completely retrained ourselves on doing tutorials. But one of the more difficult things to overcome was labs. How do you teach labs in this online space when labs are so much about getting in there? Like a lot of people, one of the first things we did was record everything. So we had recorded labs, we had demonstrators or teaching associates performing an experiment, and we captured that on video. And in that particular case, it was my voice as the audio of all of it. And so we could use that to give the students observations, and they could get data out of that, and they could still get some transferable skills, but it was difficult to obviously mimic technical skills, actually putting glassware together. In Australia and in New Zealand, we've been very privileged in the sense that even late last year, COVID-19 did not have the same grip on us that it did have on other nations and other parts of the world. So we were actually able to, in semester 2 last year, have some students come in and do physical activities. They were incredibly physically distanced. A room that normally held 72 students now only held 12. And we could only do 2 of these exercises throughout a whole semester. So it was very limited, but at least they could get in and they could work with some glassware. But regardless of whether or not I'm talking about semester 1 when it was all online or semester 2 when it was mostly online, we still had all of these online activities. So we had to find some way to talk about, think about, and educate on technical skill development when you couldn't physically use your hands. So there's a huge range of ways that technical skills have been considered. This is a slide I stole from myself from last year. And I don't want to go through the individual items here, but to say that obviously skill development or technical skill development is a huge consideration. And it's something that we've been arguing about for quite a long time in terms of how best to develop these skills in our students. Many of these items require you to be in a lab and are best associated with being in a lab. But one of them, the top left, and this is where I start giving free sales for the Learning Sciences guys, are these simulations and these videos of techniques where students can potentially play around with a simulation, watch a video of a technique, and get some sort of feeling for how things are actually done. For those of you who haven't seen these before, I'm going to share directly from our Learning Sciences simulations. These are on our Canvas platform. The students could access them. The way in which they operate, they are interactive. So I can try and move, say, the weighing boat onto the balance, and it yells at me and tells me, well, no, your balance isn't clean. You can't do that yet. So I have to bring over the brush and I need to clean it up. And the idea is that I'm the one actually doing this. I'm putting things together. I'm clicking it. One of my favorite is if I try to pick up the solid and I move it too quickly, it spills everywhere, so I get yelled at again that I have to tap off the excess solid. So it's quite an interactive process. Now, this is not a perfect representation of a real lab, of course it isn't, but at least it's allowing them to see some of the equipment and getting the students to start considering how we might be undertaking these techniques alongside videos of real situations of using real glassware. And so this really gave us a rather unique opportunity where we had students in semester one who were completely online, had only ever seen techniques, at least at our university, through simulations and videos. And then they came in second semester and they did do some limited on-campus activities. And so it led to, or for us, a chance to ask a relatively simple but important question, which was, we've got en masse students doing these simulations, thousands of students, and we want to know, did the simulations have an effect on them? When they come into the actual physical lab, what impact do the students think this is having? So we're going to just look from their perception. And as a practical part of today as well, we did have some questions that we asked students. I'm going to talk towards coming out of the COVID-19 era and the kind of things you can expect from the students as they first come back into the labs after the insanity of everything they have experienced. To do this, we had a paper-based questionnaire, and this questionnaire was, again, developed before COVID-19. So we actually already had it in place, and we had prior data of what our students thought towards their technical skills before any of this happened. In both cases, it was paper-based. So paper-based in 2019, given at the end, their final lab of the year, after they had done 18 labs at 3 hours apiece. And then in 2020, they'd only had 2 labs, which were very technical focused, not experiments per se, much more simplistic. In 2019, again, this is data that I showed last year. So we had about 510 students. And in general, what I could say from the closed questions of that questionnaire is the students weren't that confident. There was almost a third of the cohort who was still not sure about their technical skills, even after an entire year of those initial steps and hours in our first year labs. And they still weren't willing to say that they knew how to take a measurement, something quite simplistic, I would argue, in our labs. And there's still almost a third of the cohort saying, look, I'm not confident enough to say that. And so they're going neutral on these questionnaires. So this questionnaire gave us a nice baseline of, okay, this is how the students felt normally. What do they think in 2020 after they've gone through all these online activities and during the COVID-19 era? So in this case, we had about 420 responses in 2020. And to compare the 2 years, because I'm looking at Likert data, which is ordinal, I used a Pearson's chi-squared test to compare every question between those 2 years. And I used a Kramer's V to tell me what kind of effect size am I looking at. Yes, there might be significant differences, but how practical and how relevant are they to us? There were only 2 questions out of all the ones that I compared that showed a large effect size in how they were responding between the 2 years. On the left here, we can see students, when referring to how confident they were using particular equipment, like an IR machine, they were far less confident in 2020. That's not surprising. They had very limited access to those machines and very limited experiences with them. So that makes perfect sense. They're going to be less confident because they just haven't had a chance to play with this stuff. What I really like, though, is the graph on the right. They enjoyed coming to labs more in 2020 because they had such a limited opportunity to actually come to them. They were excited to do so. So we're seeing an increase in enjoyment, something that we don't talk about a lot, but very, very important in getting our students involved. So I liked that there was this more excitement around labs because they just couldn't get to them nearly as much as before. In terms of questions that still showed a significant effect, but less of an effect size, so this is medium in this case, we saw that students, when they were talking about being able to perform an experiment, so this is setting up an experiment, interestingly, they moved away from neutral responses and split themselves between agree and disagree in 2020. I can't really say what that means other than we're seeing more of a mixed response from the students on this particular item. We also saw that students were more intimidated. So that's the top graph showing getting more agree responses in 2020. And you can see a little bit of a shift towards the left for the anxiety as well. So students aren't getting as much lab time, so they're more likely to be intimidated, more likely to be anxious in that environment, as compared to people who went there every week for both semesters in 2019. They did also find this question's a bit confusing at first because it's actually saying the techniques were difficult. So if they're less likely to agree to this statement, they're less likely to think they were difficult. So in 2020, the experiments, well, they weren't experiments. They were basic glassware manipulation. One was using a titration, the other one was using a separation funnel and doing a recrystallization and TLC, that kind of stuff. So it was more manipulation of that glassware. There were also questions that were only relevant in 2020 because they focused on the simulations, on using those videos in the Learning Sciences platform. What we found is that students generally agreed that they were engaging with the simulations over and over and over again until they got the correct answer. They saw the mistakes, they'd go back and they'd fix it. We even know that there was, I think, and Ian can correct me on this later, but it was up to 30,000 uses of the simulations in semester 1 alone last year. So the students were definitely getting in and using these simulations as part of their learning. We didn't assess them. The students had a technique quiz, but they didn't necessarily need the simulation to answer that. However, we got a large number of students, over 50%, agreeing or strongly agreeing to, I actually went in there again and again because I knew I wasn't being assessed. So it didn't matter. There was no pressure, particularly on the use of that simulation. However, there's still almost 50% of the class that's neutral or even disagree. So I'm not convinced about assessment one way or the other at this stage, but it's an interesting item to say that we, oh, what was that?
Oh, sorry, you got about 2 minutes left.
Okay, I'll go quick. In terms of whether or not there should be a simulation or a video, the students were split. So I would argue this is an example of giving both to the students, not one or the other. They did use the feedback from the simulations even when they were in class, or at least the students felt that they did. So there's almost 60% of them saying that, yes, when I was in class, I thought about the feedback from the simulation. Importantly, that this does not replace a demonstrator. You can have your simulations all you want, but there still should be a person there to actually talk to the students. In terms of the open questions, we're still analyzing this, but I'll quickly say when we asked them what effects that the simulations had on their experience, there were two main camps. Either they felt, yes, fantastic, they prepared me, they were really useful, allowed me to make mistakes and learn from them, or they thought they didn't do anything. So there were two very different camps of students here. But I would argue that it was almost an equal mixture of them. And so camp one is still very, very important to support them and to use these simulations. And just because camp two, they feel like it didn't have an effect, doesn't mean it didn't. They just didn't feel like it did. That was their perception of it. In terms of what worked well in our return to on-campus activities, don't assess them in the first couple. Give them a nice, relaxed attempt to come into the labs at the start, because they are going to be intimidated by them. Because of the social distancing, we have less students in the room, which is always nice. 2 is not enough for an entire semester. I think none of us are surprised by that, but students commonly stated that 2 wasn't enough. They didn't like being individual because of the social distancing, and because there was one demonstrator to 12 students over a bigger space, it meant that they had to wait for that demonstrator to come back more than they would have normally in the past. Very quickly, when returning to on-campus labs, I think the things to remember, students will be excited, but they're going to be less confident. They're going to be a bit more intimidated as they haven't been in a lab in a while. So having those unassessed, nice, gentle experiences at the start is useful. With regards to the learning sciences, they are well received. They do help lower that stress and anxiety. And for a large number of students, they are being utilized in the lab time. So they are very useful and impactful for them. But they don't replace getting onto a lab. You have to get in there to actually develop these skills. They are a support mechanism, not a replace. With that, I'll finish up with my collaborators who helped develop the questionnaire and analyzing the data, with Richard and Dylan at the University of Leicester, and Shane Wilkinson, who is currently now the first year lab director and also working with me on this project. So thank you very much. That's the end of my talk.
Thank you so much, Stephen, for a fascinating insight of what can be done with one of these research grants. So thank you so much. Just a quickie, just because we are a little bit over, but there was a few questions regarding, and particularly for my interest, has the experience of what we had to go through last year rethought about your pre-lab activities that you'd give students beforehand. Has there been anything that has changed because of what you've had to do, because they had to do labs online last year, that you've decided to keep for when you go back to relatively normal this year?
Definitely the simulations and the videos and having that technique focus. I think we need to be careful there, and I don't know if Michael was in there in the chat box, because there is a concern of getting too detailed on the techniques in your pre-lab quizzes. But having a general, this is how a titration looks and how it's set up, I think is very important, just so they don't walk into a lab and get terrified when they're seeing this glassware for the first time. So I would definitely keep these simulations in the future.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Well, you've the chat has exploded, as what normally does in your little talks. So please do have a read through, and please do continue the conversation. All right.